Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scrivener, and today I'm going to be going over the long list of the 2022 Women's Prize, and I'm really excited that I love books that focus on women that are by women authors. There isn't any books that are complete duds on here that I would never pick up, but I am going to be ranking them from my least likely to pick them up into the books that I'm most excited for. I'm not sure how many of the books I'm actually going to be able to get a hold of before the shortlist because my library does not have most of them. On the plus side of not being really readily available, a lot of these books were not super well known. I think 5 or 6 of them are by debut authors, and I was really excited to see that. Salt Lick by Lulu Allison, and it is about this town where like everything has moved overseas and now it's rural and kind of like it's described as dystopian but not dystopian, but like further down the line, and it is narrated by feral cows. As someone who grew up around from cow fields, they can be definitely a little feral. I always wanted to ride a cow because that's what my nana did, but I was always very afraid of the cows that like meandered and then every once in a while broke fences into my yard. So I don't know if that's like appealing, but it's also kind of appealing, but kind of not. Anyways, I probably won't pick it up, but if I ever had it in my library, I probably would. It's kind of one of those books. And that is kind of similar to the next book as well, and this is Remote Sympathy by Catherine Chidi, and this one is interesting because it is by an Australian author, but it takes place in Germany in the 1940s, and it follows this woman who moves from Munich to this kind of outskirt town where her husband is administrator for a concentration camp that is a prison camp. And it is interesting, and it discusses the ideas of like how willful ignorance and stuff like that work. And it's a book where like if it was there I would read it, but it doesn't like draw me as something that hasn't been discussed before. The next book on my list I'm struggling to say because I have a really bad speech impediment, but I will put it right here because it is not that hard of a word to say, but I'm struggling today. This one looks at a famous author who has re-emerged and wants to talk about his art, and meanwhile we look at his family, especially his wife, who's always been steadfast, but in recent years has had this growing thing to want to show her own art that she's never been able to because she's always had to be a mother and a wife. I love looking at family dynamics, I love looking at family dramas, and I would definitely be interested in this. The next book, I'm not sure if it would be like my favorite thing or my least favorite thing. I can't decide. Like, this is a book that I have gone through and like looked at several people's like reviewing and talking about them, and I read the description like 5 times trying to understand, and it has so many moving parts, or maybe I'm just tired and can't understand what this book is about. But this is Creatures of Passage by Moro Yojide, and this is like Echoes of Beloved, which sounds really good, by Toni Morrison. And then we have like this haunted taxi with these different people combining and moving things, and this felt like it had like too much obscure random things going on and also too much information and not enough information going on in the description that I was like, I'm not sure what's going on here, but like the haunted car and the other things sound really good, but I just don't know what's going on. I'm not also often a huge fan of like different people in different decades. Like, I really love like life stories, and I love stories that take place across people's lives or like at different points in people's lives, but I'm not normally a huge fan of stories in which 2 people have 2 separate timelines. And talking about that trope, the next one is The Great Circle by Maggie Stipshed. This is obviously a much more well-known book than some of the others because it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I almost picked it up. If it was not 25 hours long, I would have already read this book, and it's still kind of one of those books that I'm like, it's 25 hours long. I'm not sure I'm that interested in it. It takes place originally in like 1914 to 2020s Prohibition era Montana with this person who wants to be a pilot, and she does some cool piloting thing, and then it also looks at the actress who plays her, and that's such an interesting thing that kind of breaks away from like the angle, like even though I'm not a huge fan of like looking at separate people, I like the idea of how someone is versus how someone is imagined and how that research, that does sound really interesting. And it like might, this book I have borrowed from the library so many times and like looked at it and I'm like, do I want to read it? I'm not sure. So if you have great words about this, like you could convince me to read it. I'm just not completely sold. The next book we're going to talk about is Flamingo by Rachel Elliott. Sherry loves her husband, Leslie. She also loves Eve. It couldn't have been a happier summer. But then Eve left and everything went gray. I've been like growing in my like love of like these complicated love dynamics. It's a very interesting thing that I'm like very keenly interested in, and like, I don't know, it just says something a lot, and it looks also at their children and how their lives combine. And yeah, I think this is a book that I would definitely want to read. Soma and Bliss by Meg Mason. I'm going to read this part, and it says, this novel is about a woman called Martha. She knows there's something wrong with her, but she doesn't know what it is. Her husband Patrick thinks she's fine. He says everything has something, and the thing is just to keep going. Martha told Patrick before they got married that she didn't want to have children. He said he didn't mind either way because he'd loved her since she was 14, and making her happy is all that matters. although he doesn't seem able to do it. The first couple lines remind me so much of The Yellow Wallpaper, which is one of my favorite short stories of all time. It's just one of my favorite stories of all time that looks at the like dynamics of depression and it deals with depression. So that makes me really, really interested. The next one, I really, really love the title. I really, really love the cover. I really love everything about it. And it's called Build Your House Around Me by Violet Cooper-Smith. It follows a century of Vietnam like history, and it deals with both like 1986 and 2011. So again, the split narration, which is kind of the major like detracting thing from this, but it looks at these two women that are both disappearing and their kind of lives and interacting it. And I think that that can be such an interesting look at ways women interact with their culture and can be like a thing about why women disappear. This is partly narrated by a tree, and it's called The Island of the Missing Tree, and it's by Edith Shafak, and it takes place with two teenagers who originally have these like secret things. One is a Greek Cypriot and one is a Turkish Cypriot, and they are meeting and having these rendezvous under this tree that is narrating their story. And then it also has a section years later with this girl woman I'm assuming is their daughter, but could just be a stranger, who has a tree, and she has nothing, and she knows nothing about this culture and this island and this world that she came from. She knows that there's trouble in the past and she knows things happen, but all her connection is this fiscus. And I have a fiscus. It's the one that sometimes appears in the background of my videos. I'm watering it right now, which means putting it in my shower. I don't know. I'm not a good plant mom, but you know, hopefully they are better plant moms and this will be a great story because it does sound really, really interesting. The next book is The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowie Heller, and this is looking at this woman who's about 50 years old, and it is the morning after she had this sexual encounter with her old love, and it kind of looks at, you know, the 24 hours around that, but also the whole history of her life and how she interconnected with her husband and this man and their children and stuff like that. And I really, really do like these stories that look at people's lives. I find it really interesting, and I find aging really interesting, and I find looking at the past very interesting. So I think this is a book that I will really enjoy. The next book is also playing a little bit with life and stories and stuff, and this is the Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki. I've heard a lot about her. She's Canadian, and I've considered picking up this and her other book on several different occasions. So I think I will. This one is about Benny who hears voices, and I think he starts it after a traumatic event, and then he finds that like in this library there's quieter voices, and then he finds a book that is narrating his own life, which definitely sounds very interesting to me. It also sounds a little pretentious, but I'm hoping that it will be like pulled off well. And then we have Careless by Kirsty Capes, and this book sounds right up my alley. It is about a girl who's in the foster care system who finds out she's pregnant and doesn't really know where to go. Some people call this more commercial fiction, which, you know, I don't really like that term because I think it's just a little pretentious, but I definitely think that this is a book that I would really, really enjoy. I love dealing with teenage pregnancy. I love dealing with foster care. They're both parts of areas that I'm passionate about, but also really enjoy reading about. And I think that this could deal with a lot of different areas that I am very interested in. So this is definitely like a yes. And we're getting into the final books that I'm like super excited about and will like very actively seek out. And that probably begins with this book here. And then we have Pashipo, which I think I'm butchering. This is also called One Sky Day sometimes, and is by Leona Sky. And this is a book that I have actively like gotten from the library, and I think over Christmas, and I ran out of time before I got to read it, but I was so excited for this. And it's about this island where all of these people have like a little bit of something, like not like magic, but a little bit of gift. And I will just read parts of what it says about it, because it says, a place of stunning beauty, incurable mischief, destiny, and mystery. It is also a place in need of change. I don't know a ton about this book, to be honest, but everything that I know about it intrigues me, and I've heard such good reviews that I do definitely want to read it. And that cover is just so, so pretty. And then we have two more books I have actively searched out, and one book that is my most highly that I found out through this, and I was like, oh my goodness, I need this book now. So the next one is The Sentence, and it looks at this woman who owns a bookstore in Minneapolis, as does the author. And we also are looking at this reader who, you know, it's a small bookstore that is haunted by someone who died on All Saints books. And I've heard that this isn't actually a huge part of the story, but it just sounds interesting. And I've heard that it deals a lot with like many characters and different dynamics and all of those things. And that is exactly my book. Like everything I've heard about this book, I like. The final revival of Opal and Nev. This book had been meaning to read list since last summer. My roommate really, really loved it. I've heard really, really great reviews from everyone, and it's being compared to Daisy Jones and the Six, and I love that book. And this is looking at like a woman who is like an Afro-punk artist who grew up in Detroit, and she meets a man at like a bar who happens to be like this British guy from like, I think it's the mid 60s or mid 70s. I think it's mid 70s. And they meet and they decide to be like this dynamic duo, and it's their relationship, and it deals with like a lot of race, but also looks at those music things and has these interviews from all these people. And that sounds exactly like my kind of book. And the only book on this that will beat it in hype levels is The Bread the Devil Needed. And this sounded so good. This is by Lisa Allen Aganasti, and it is a book about this woman who is about to turn 40. She works and like runs this really cool boutique in Port of Spain, Barbados, and she has all the successful things and no one knows that she's actually being abused. And I think that I really appreciate these dynamics, and I really appreciate looking at the ways that people can be feisty and independent and all of these things, but also experience abuse. And I love looking at these stories. It also deals with her having an illicit affair, kind of trying to like deal with her fear by trying to escape, but that's also not a good relationship. And she's seen someone get murders, and it makes her think that she could actually be next. And I think all of those dynamics are going to work really, really well, and I cannot wait to read this book. I think I would read any book on this list, but the ones that are closer to the front are definitely ones that I'm going to actively seek out and want to read. So let me know which books kind of piqued your interest the most, and I would love to talk to you next time.